results from the 3rd, and then Dustin will be covering both state and federal results and impact and that kind of thing. But I'll turn it over to our Director of Government Affairs for the introduction and lay the landscape. So Steve Firman, why don't you take it away?
Okay, thank you, Carrie. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us this morning. We're real pleased to have not one, but two of our trusted colleagues from the Iowa Chamber Alliance with us. Dustin Miller, who is the Executive Director of the Iowa Chamber Alliance, is going to give us our election overview, but he will have a little help filling in a few of the blanks, perhaps, with Brad Epperly, who also joins us. Brad is our chief lobbying partner, and they're both with the Nyemaster Good law firm in Des Moines. So with that, I just want to cover the Zoom basics, if you will. We are going to record this session and it will be posted, so just be aware of that. Please turn yourselves on mute, and most all of you already have. If you have questions, bring them through the chat, and maybe at the end we can open people's mics if you need to. But if you have questions as we go, just put them through the chat and we'll monitor that and try to make sure that Dustin and Brad are aware of what you're thinking. So with that, Dustin, I'm going to give it to you.
Appreciate it, Steve. And I got to do this in person last year, and I wish I could be with you, but so is life right now. But this is always a good group and gets a lot of questions. So I appreciate Steve and Carrie putting this together. I'm going to cover Brad and I will cover about 20 to 30 minutes of just kind of an overview. And then, want to give plenty of time because guessing that people are going to have a lot of questions. So, and Carrie said, the results of November 3rd, but as we all know, we don't necessarily have results for certain places, including a congressional seat here in Iowa. So the first things first is I like to actually look back and see, okay, November 2nd, what I was predicting, this is never a good thing, whether you're a sports commentator or a news weatherman, but I like to look and see, okay, what was I thinking beforehand, and what was true and what did I get wrong? And the big question that I think people had going into 2020 is, did Donald Trump in 2016 break political science as we knew it? And I think it's a complicated answer. There is some yes and there is some no. On the yes side, clearly the polling industry is in disarray. You've even seen one of the tried and true Larry Sabato say that he doesn't know if he's going to do it next election because of how wrong the polling industry got it. And ultimately, it's not, if you look at the actual polling, it's not that they were totally wrong. It's just trying to identify the difference between the early vote and then the next vote in a large turnout election was really challenging. But they did predict at the national level the correct result, but at the local level did not anticipate that the coattails of Donald Trump would have such an impact. And that's kind of the other yes, did Donald Trump break the system, is I think really what you see in this country, Iowa for the first time ever, no party voters are not the largest contingent between our registered parties. You're seeing a much more of a culture of division in our politics. And really, this was a referendum on Donald Trump. And what you saw is his supporters came out in mass election day and had major impacts across all many states, including our own. And I'll get into that a bit more. But where Donald Trump didn't break the system is it's really difficult to fight math. I always said going into this election, if you looked back at the previous elections, just even back to 08, Obama won with 52.9% of the vote. His next election, it was around 51. And Hillary Clinton in 2016 only got 46% of the vote. So I always said, it's really challenging math-wise for him to put together the electoral map in the Electoral College map, if that number for whoever he was running against was in the 48 or higher range. So his math was really tricky, because when you take the bottom 3 states from 2016, it was a total of 78,000 votes, that being Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And he needed all 3 of those to put together his coalition and win. You take the bottom 3 that Joe Biden currently is ahead in, it's not, they haven't all been certified. You take the bottom 3 and they're only 46,000 votes between those 3. But even if Joe Biden were to lose all 3 of those, he's still ahead in the electoral college. So it's really difficult to beat the math when you talk about an electoral map. The other thing that I was correct on is it's really challenging to overcome economics. In the history of our country, after following a depression or recession, or back in the 1800s, we called them panics, there really was, there's never been, the incumbent doesn't stay. Or if there isn't an incumbent, if there's an outgoing president, then their party loses the presidency. And I thought that would be very challenging, with COVID for Trump to overcome that history of our politics. So there's a yes and the no to the system, but at the same time, you also have to look at what were the important factors, because, the incumbency for him too is extremely important. Anybody who has lost incumbency in recent memory, whether it's George H.W. Bush or Jimmy Carter, there were other factors at play. For Jimmy Carter, it was economics, the Iran hostage issue. For George H.W. Bush, it was economics, but it was also a third-party candidate that polled, close to 15% of the vote, which impacted his math. So it's important to understand that, yes, there is a culture of our politics which impacted the race, but ultimately there's a big difference between what happened at the national level and what's happening at our state and local levels from that. So what else did we get right? We knew that COVID was going to be a major impact. When you get down to our state level, I said this earlier this week on a call that Ann Seltzer of the polling industry, I'm guessing she's going to get a lot more calls in the future, and because she was so close in Iowa in her predictions. Trump won Iowa in 2016 at 9.41%. This round he wanted an even 8%. She predicted him in the 5% range, 5 to 7, I believe. She was at the upper ends of her scale, and she was almost dead on. And then had Joni Ernst slightly below that. And Brad and I have said repeatedly that they were talking about an underperformance for Senator Ernst through this, and we always thought that they were tied together. And ultimately, I think we always felt that, Trump would do well in Iowa because just demographically who he appeals to, it kind of fits our state, and so, their fates were tied together. So Ann Seltzer's numbers really kind of fit. I think if you ask us if we were surprised that the House held the Republican majority, that's not surprising. What's surprising or shocking is that they would expand their majority by 6 seats. And that's purely the coattails of a Donald Trump kind of culture of politics that brought out his people en masse. But to go back to the COVID aspect, Brad and I would agree wholeheartedly. Democrats chose to run digital campaigns almost exclusively for local races. And I think you saw a major difference in knocking doors and not knocking doors. And so, it's interesting because, anybody who wins, whether it's Joe Biden or Pat Grassley, I think you'll have people say this is a mandate, but I think it's trickier just because of the mechanics of how these votes came out, whether it was kind of the cult of personality of Donald Trump, whether it was some mechanical issue in not knocking doors. Our politics are changing. We are becoming more tribal, which had these impacts, and there were people that were walking in to simply vote for a party because of that culture and that. So ultimately, the other important factors that I saw as far as the economics and the unemployment, as I mentioned, the incumbency, there's no doubt that the civil unrest nationwide had an impact, irrespective of and I know, locally there as well, this has had an impact. But, when you hear phrases like defund the police, it doesn't mean to get rid of police departments, right? And we could have a reasonable policy conversation on this call that's not what defund the police means. However, that's not how campaigns work. So it's pretty easy to take a phrase like defund the police and use it as to grow fear that that's what it means. So there's no doubt that things like that played into this on both the left and the right. And I think we'll continue to see this unrest because, Donald Trump won, and I've said this since 2016, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump aren't that far off from one another. I know they probably wouldn't like to hear me say that, but really what they are is disruption agents that are outsiders to the government that want to, impact people that don't feel like they're part of the system. And so I don't doubt that we will continue to see this civil unrest because there's just a large contingent of Americans that don't feel like they're part of the system, whether that's legal or economic or otherwise. Our demographics will have a major impact. Joe Biden only won a few urban counties in Iowa, very similar to Fred Hubble in 2018. And demographics are going to continue to play out. And if our politics play out demographically between urban and rural like they are now, I don't see Iowans, just because Iowa is a state of small towns, it'll be interesting to see how redistricting and those sorts of things play out. But as it landed at the national and local level is, it looks like Joe Biden will win well over the 270 needed, in the lower 300s for the Electoral College. Iowa, which used to be a swing state, is really, at least in the past few elections, doesn't look that way. We kind of start looking more like Indiana or Arkansas, which used to be, 10, 20 years ago, much more purple. And at least in these past few cycles, it just isn't trending that way. So how does that impact? And then when you boil it down, there will be a Republican trifecta at the Capitol for another 2 years at least. How does this impact the business community? And I think at the national level, what that does kind of worry me are trend from a swing state, because I would think that we as a talent attraction would want to look more like North Carolina and Arizona, which are having more, growing their industries with professional degrees and things of that nature, rather than, I don't think we certainly want to head the directions of out of that. Like, we want to be growing our talent and attracting people. But on the other side, at the national level, what concerns me is there's no doubt that there's a large faction at the far left that will need to get some things out of this election. So my worry is that agencies like EPA are run by, more progressive elements, which if people have water or air or other permits, it could be a real challenge in a much more aggressive and active EPA. But on the balance at the national level, I said this Wednesday, I don't think McConnell, I think he's liked being in control with a Republican president, but I don't know any inside info, but I don't believe that he particularly enjoys working with President Trump. He has a long relationship with Joe Biden. And I think ultimately once the elections get certified and we get past some of these cases, I think really Mitch McConnell is in the catbird seat. He can really kind of control things because he has a long-term relationship with Joe Biden and can work with him. But if he doesn't, and the progressive wing really does drive the policy, then Mitch McConnell can simply use Joe Biden as his foil to continue his majorities in the Senate. So he's really in a win-win situation when the election gets certified. And I don't want to dance around that. I mean, the votes at the national level are just really not in the range. Unless there's some evidence out there. If you're talking about currently Pennsylvania went over 60,000 votes. That the likelihood of that getting flipped even in a recount, and you're outside of automatic recount territory in a state like that, it just isn't likely. But certainly let people play it out in the legal system. That's why we have it. So that's at the national level. From a business impact at the local level, we're seeing, again, we've gone back to 2016 margins in the state of Iowa, and as Brad would tell you, 2017 was the most active session in a long history, in a very long time, rightly or wrongly, whether you agreed with it or not. I don't think we're going to see the same thing coming out of these margins here, just simply because COVID is still clearly going to have an impact. We don't know what that's going to look like at the State House in 2021. But also they've done a lot of the things that they wanted to do over that 4-year trifecta. But you will see Invest in Iowa. The governor has said that she wants to continue. This is raising the sales tax a penny to cover quality of life projects, mental health, and a tax reform for personal tax. I would guess with the Senate, they're going to be interested in significant tax reform out of that if that were to ever come to bear. And I think you'll see some hard nuts and bolts business things like tort reform and some other things that haven't been able to be accomplished in the past 2 years with a thinner majority. But I think one of the things we have to watch for at the local level, at the state level is, are there things that impact the attractiveness of Iowa becoming welcoming, whether it's the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and some of these other things that turn people away, especially and concern very large employers like Deere and others about how do you get people from other communities to move in. With that, I'm going to kick it over to Brad to see anything I missed thus far.
Oh, you don't miss anything, Miller. I just color it differently sometimes. Couple comments. I think on the voting trends in this state as it relates to President Trump, I think he is definitely impacted it in terms of being a different type of politician. He does have his core supporters, but I think it's the extent of that impact. I think it's hard to really put a fine point on. When you look at districts 1 and 2 in Iowa, it looks like District 2 may flip. I mean, it's whether it flips or not doesn't really matter. The fact that it's that close is the significance. And then District 1, which is flipping back again after Congresswoman Finkenauer only having 1 term. I think on a state level, in terms of our state elected folks, I mean, the truly astounding thing is not that these swings can't happen. And this really, to me, you have to look at it as kind of a swing because of the uptick in the House and the fact that the Senate holds on to 32 to 18. Those kinds of numbers in this state happen, and they happen for both parties from time to time. But when they do happen, you get that kind of number. It gets chiseled back down. It's just too difficult to hold on to it, but yet they did. And so, to me, yes, COVID definitely had an impact. The Democrats' decision to go all in terms of how they campaigned, doing it a digital campaign, definitely affected things. But to this extent, is quite astounding that, numbers wise, there were, what was there, 8 retirements for Republicans in the House. So they had 45 incumbents that all got reelected. They didn't lose a single one. They flipped seats back in the Des Moines metro area that the Democrats had targeted in 18 and flipped. Of the 8 retired seats, they held 7 of them. The Democrats had 3 retirements, and Republicans won one of those 3. And defeated 6 Democrat incumbents, and that's really, really astounding when you think about the fact that you didn't have a new Republican president on the ticket getting elected. You had a Republican getting beat on the ticket, and they did these things. Same thing. The numbers are very similar in the Senate. Only half of the seats are up. 25 seats. They had 7 retirements of their 19 seats that were up. They held all 12 that incumbents that ran again, and of the 7 open seats due to Republican retirements, they won 6 of them, losing actually my Senate seat here because of Charles Schneider's retirement. And then they flipped a Democrat seat to stay at 32, and those are really tough numbers. Dustin mentioned they're we're going to have a trifecta here for obviously 2 more years, but at those kinds of numbers, in a presidential year, which is a better year for Democrats historically, when they took 60 seats back in 2010 in the House, that was an off-year election. Terry Branstad came back to office. A reason for that kind of big turnout. But yet, because the president had loyal followers, he also had very loyal opponents, and they still swept in those kinds of numbers. We saw Senator Peterson announced that she was not going to run again for leader, and I think everybody expected that. We haven't heard anything out of Representative Pritchard. That's a tougher call, I think, because Todd hasn't been in the seat very long, and I'm sure they're going to discuss what to do about that. But, you're talking about several election cycles here before I think the Democrats can have a reasonable shot at taking back either of those majorities. And so we should expect them to really, really, really target the governor's office in 2 years, and the folks that run for that, because absent that, right, they're really just not going to have continue to not have a say in the government here in the state.
Yeah, the only one last thing I would add is, we're now over 150 million people in this country voted. And just for perspective, 08, I have the numbers here, which was the largest before that. So you had 69.5 million in 08 for Democrats and close to 60 million for Republicans. I mean, these voting numbers, clearly both bases were energized, but certainly more on the Republican side in certain states. In Iowa, we were 3,000 votes short of having 1 million votes in the bank before Election Day. And then another 700,000 people voted on Election Day. That's really, I think it's great. That kind of enthusiasm. However, the worrisome part for me is, as I mentioned, this more culture of tribalism in our politics, where politics are more about who somebody is and not just ideas. And I just worry more and more in that divisiveness, not only for what Brad and I do at the Capitol on a day-to-day basis, but just, friends and neighbors that I'm sure you're seeing at the local level as well. Steve, I'll stop there. Any questions from you?
No questions from me, and I don't see anything yet in the chat. Oh, wait, here's a question looking for a prediction on the Georgia Senate race. The 2 Senate runoffs in Georgia. What do you think is going to happen there?
Yeah, I think everybody is pretty surprised. There was a poll that came out this week that, after I told you that the polling industry is dead. But there was a poll this week that both of those are very close. You're going to see a massive amount of money poured in there before January, a massive amount, because it's the game for Democrats that they can get. If they can get the Senate, then you can obviously do a whole lot more. So I would think that one goes and not the other. It seems like the Warnock-Loeffler one, he has outperformed her in polling, and but Senator Perdue, has said some things that impacted his race from just winning it outright. So, but I would think one of those goes with the amount of money that pours in, but it kind of, I think we all need to wait and see what happens to the president and if he leaves the White House before that time period. If you noticed yesterday or 2 days ago, Steve, that Michael Cohen said that he believes that the president will go to Mar-a-Lago for Christmas and not come back.
That's a good one. Questions are now starting to roll in, so let's see what we got here. One questioner says, we seem to be in a time of continued disinformation. How does that factor into the future of our democracy?
That's a great question, and it's scary. Always politics was about, utilizing something that might not be fully true, but at least there was some hint of that. The idea that people can just, and I'm amazed on my Facebook feed, and I'm from a small town and still live in a small town, the amount of stuff that people share on Facebook that even, the next day gets stripped down, hey, this is misinformation. It's really terrifying how easily people can be duped. And these things that you see on Facebook and Twitter, what's so scary about them is if somebody were to take 10 seconds to do a Google search, they would know that it's not real. And I think it's very real that folks in China and Russia and other places, it's just too easy. I mean, it doesn't cost that much money on these platforms, and people are so tied to them. I really worry about this new movement towards Parler. I think it's an even further division. And I worry that it creates this new forum to radicalize people. I mean, so I'm really worried. And the best story I can give you is I actually worked at Parliament back in 2005 and 6. And the member I worked for is a college classmate of Tony Blair. And he said, but he was a Conservative Party member, Tony Blair's a Labor. And he was describing the war in Iraq at the time. And he said, when Tony Blair stepped to the dispatch box in 2003 and said, there are weapons of mass destruction, this is the reason we're going into Iraq. He said, they have to trust the executive that they're getting intelligence and information that they don't have. And you want to trust, and for him, trust my friend that this is the truth. And he said, and when members of Parliament found out that not only was that not true when Tony Blair said it at the dispatch box, but that he knew that it wasn't true, it's things like that that have a real impact on people. And Brad and I talk about it all the time, all the way back to Watergate, Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky. these things just have chipped away and eroded people's trust. And it's really worrisome because, I mean, it just does feel like a powder keg, like people don't feel a part of the system.
I think too, yeah, I mean, on the other side about information, full disclosure, we represent the newspapers and the broadcasters here in the state and are ardent supporters of theirs. Having said that, I think one of the lasting legacies of Donald Trump is the, how does the media come back from this election? They didn't even try to hide it or pretend on a national level that they were objective. They weren't. And whether he was his own worst enemy most of the time. But you're still supposed to be an objective journalist, and they weren't even pretending. And some of these, I think the impact going forward is people going to alternatives for their news sources. Some of those are very good, some of them not so much. And sorting through, where you get your information. Part of the reason we all felt we were all surprised wasn't just the polls, in my opinion. It was the reporting. It was the feeling that we had going into the election of how everything was going to go. And then, we wake up on Wednesday morning and everybody's shocked. Well, maybe if we've been talking about things in a more balanced fashion, not to use one of the network's catchphrases, but maybe if we've been reporting things in a more balanced fashion, that we would have really had a more objective view of what people were seeing and feeling out there. And I think the media is so important to our democracy, dating back to, our founding, and they've really got some soul searching to do, in my opinion.
Okay. At the federal level, we seem to be losing power fairly regularly, with Grassley rolling out of the finance chair and Loebsack retiring from energy and commerce. Do you see any hope for us to turn that around with a group of new representatives? Will Senator Ernst's power, do you think that's going to increase any now that she's been reelected? And reelected to the leadership team as well. What's your view?
Yeah, back in 2012, 13, I was saying this, that any Iowan at that time should, irrespective of your party, vote for Tom Harkin and Chuck Grassley every cycle, because nowhere in the world did Iowa have the kind of power it did, but the United States Senate. I've had this conversation with guys like Bill Northey about, in particular, like water quality. You lose a Tom Latham, a Leonard Boswell, Chuck Grassley, a Tom Harkin, like
Jim Leach.
Yeah, it's just not the same, and if we keep cycling through congressmen and women, it just isn't the same. When David Young was elected in the 3rd district, he got put on appropriations right away because of his background in Grassley's office. That doesn't happen. So yeah, I think what this question is getting at is my worry is, how do we replicate these? And you just can't without people that have been in that seat. And quite frankly, I had this conversation yesterday with a friend out in DC that you don't just go out there for a 2-year time period and figure out how the place works. It just takes time to know how the levers move. So yeah, getting at this question, my worry is as you start losing these things, if we start cycling through people, our influence is less. Brad, you got anything?
No, my deference to you on federal on
but Ernst is the most likely candidate because
Yeah.
now he's a 2-term senator. But I think the reason her race was tougher than she wanted it to be was, the thing that Chuck Grassley has done really well is he can go to any one of any town and say, hey, there's an ethanol plant that I did, or a wind tower, or a child care center because of rural development funding. And, that's how he and Harkin lasted all those years, is they did things that impacted people. So yeah, she is the most likely candidate. But yeah, it's real worrisome if you continue to keep cycling through congressmen, men and women.
Flipping back to the state, you said that the Democrats were probably going to target the governor pretty heavily, simply because that's about the best thing that they have in their arsenal right now. Do you see any candidates arising yet that you'd be willing to bet on for being the Democrat in that race?
Well, I think you first need to think about the fact that there isn't a standard bearer for the party. Tom Miller's been there a long time, Fitzgerald's been there a long time, but they're really not the standard bearer for a party, which has really been lost since Harkin retired, and Vilsack's involvement in politics on a more regular basis. I don't see a clear front runner at this point. I think there's clearly speculation that Rob Sand would want to run. Think about there's only one Democrat, Cindy Axne as a congresswoman, maybe that's it, but there's nobody in mind in particular that I think comes to front of mind. How about you, Brad?
Yeah, no, I mean, the two you mentioned, Axne would have a sort of a built-in head start, so to speak, because of Polk County. She's won that pretty significantly in both of her races, and is really the only reason she's winning the 3rd district, or I should say the only reason, a significant reason. Rob's an ambitious guy, and I don't think anybody believes he wanted to be auditor for life by any means. The problem that the standard bearer problem, or sort of the bench or the up and comer type of thing that I think the Democrats face is, you mentioned Tom Miller. A group of us have talked about that. The Attorney General's office is oftentimes a stepping stone office, and Miller has held that position for decades. So how do you groom somebody coming up? And that's part of the reason I'm sure Rob split off and went over and ran for something else, because Tom wasn't was going to still be in office. The other thing comes in terms of having being in the minority. In the House, Democrats have been in the minority for 10 years now. They're going to be in there another 2, so that's 12-year minority. So how do you find those up and comers to when you're not able to be out in front as much as you would like to see now? Abby Finkenauer, she was in the minority. She split off and ran successfully for the 1st district. So who knows? Teresa Greenfield, I don't know. I think it's to be seen. I think as Dustin indicated, I think the 2 most obvious are Congresswoman Axne and Auditor Sand.
And Steve Firman.
I thought we were running you.
Wasn't he part of the Bull Moose Party?
Thanks, guys. Okay, let's see. Given that Iowa, as you've already indicated, is pretty much solidly red, and you couple that with the fact that the Democrats sort of dislike the caucuses, do you think there's any chance Iowa's going to keep a first in the nation in 2024?
I really don't. The person who's being vindicated, I think, right now is Troy Price. After all the grief he took in February for the Iowa caucuses, your next step would be, a Nevada, and they still don't have their election results done. So the mechanics of getting these things put together, Nevada really stole Iowa's mechanics to put their caucus together, and they still don't run it well. So say what you will. I mean, I think people just in this world of 24-hour news cycles and social media, it's like people are just so, I saw at caucus night, they're like, well, if we don't have the result by midnight, all these candidates want to be wheels up. And it's like, that's not our problem. But I just think mechanically, other people, it's difficult to replicate. And, I know that one of the most ardent people against, the Electoral College is Mayor Buttigieg, who won Iowa. And full disclosure, as Brad mentioned, I helped out with his caucus. And one of the things I've told them is like, how in the world could you be against a Electoral College in an Iowa caucus when where in the world else would a mayor from South Bend have the ability to come out of nowhere but Iowa, where you can go from coffee shop to coffee shop and create a movement. And, for people that say, well, Iowa's not diverse and, it's like, okay, Iowa caucuses have gone for an African-American, a female, and a homosexual. So like, don't tell me that our people in our state aren't reasonable people to look at it, the candidates and come up with a good. So the alternative just doesn't seem to be real for us to lose that first in the nation status, but I could be proven wrong.
Okay. Do you anticipate any changes to the mail-in or absentee ballot voting system?
I fully believe that you're going to have your absentee in the day of, I just think that's pretty clear, especially with the margins we're seeing.
The thing about mail-in too, and I completely agree that needs to happen. It's not that we know there are problems when you keep counting after election day, but it feels like there are, and we should, when it's done. I mean, Iowa, have a lot of people have issues with Paul Pate, but I mean, we knew. We've had a little bit of issue in District 2, but those are because of 2 precincts. I mean, that was run really well, and we need to know. I mean, we need to know Wednesday morning after these elections where things are at, because, I flippantly said to my brothers, who were having problems with the result of the presidential level, and, we're going to, fraud and all this kind of stuff. And I just said flippantly, look, they're going to keep counting in these other states until, Biden's ahead. That's the way it felt. And we just can't keep going on and on and on after these elections. When you know where the numbers are and you have people involved, people, we can't be questioning things.
And I think too, Brad and I've discussed this, for a number of cycles. I've done, because I used to do voter protection the day of, so I've done absentee for a number of cycles, and I will continue. But if you told me, hey, you just need to get it in before the election, which I do anyway, and that's I do that anyway. If there needs to be a carve out for people that truly do live abroad or military, I mean, that's really what this was designed for, right? But at the same time, I think we need to recognize that, we had 1 million people vote before Election Day, and that's before Election Day. This isn't including everything after. I checked that number on 11/2. So I just think people have to be careful because, you want as many people to vote as possible. But to Brad's point, it is worrisome that it calls into question, is it real or not? And it can foment the argument of people that don't believe it.
Yeah, the polling numbers are, I mean, of course, they vary depending upon party, right? Right now, somewhere around 60 or 70% of Republicans don't trust the election, and, same number of Democrats think it was a good election, right? So the loser questions it, and I just think all this I think the continued counting just contributes to that. There needs to be a cutoff.
Okay. One person here in the chat just points out, back to talking about the media, that there was an obscure report in the Cedar Rapids Gazette, and that ended up being the article cited the most against Abby in her whole election. And so it goes on to say the media needs to research more in depth the source of the articles that they publish. And I think that you were kind of getting at that, just somebody agreeing with you.
I think it's twofold. The money mechanics of the media are changing. And that certainly has an impact. I think Ann Seltzer would tell you that, they put out the congressional districts. I don't believe that Ann really wanted to do that because mechanically, from a polling standpoint, it didn't make any sense. And it showed Ashley up the same levels as Feenstra Schulten race. And I think that is probably a money issue where it's, you're trying to drive readership. But it also is true that, these bloggers that don't adhere to any sort of journalistic standards, the news media is trying to stay ahead of them so there just becomes this problem of who gets there first, and knowing you're competing with people that are essentially cheating. Brad and I know this, that when the Bill Dix scandal happened,
Just thinking of that.
the other news media had the same video and information, but they actually worked to confirm it like you do as a journalist. But a blogger doesn't have to do that. So the blogger gets all the, praise for that. But, I think praise should be given to the Des Moines Register and other folks who actually work to confirm something. But I think everybody should be forced to, watch All the President's Men and things like that, the Post, so that people see how the media should work, rather than, just delving into these blogs and things that there's no verification. And I think that's the question that I like seeing about these elections right now is, you see, Rudy Giuliani doing a press conference, and then you have Republicans saying, okay, if there's evidence, give it to us so that we can, be with you. But I think if you throw bombs out there, it just causes more and more problems within our electorate.
Well, that pretty much covers what's in the chat. Does anybody else have any questions? You can just turn your mic on and ask them. I'm going to pick on a good friend and ask Willard to open up his microphone, because I'm just curious if you have any reflections from the point of view of a former renowned state legislator.
Thanks, Steve. One of the things that I caught that the Republicans had 60 in the House back in 2010. I was kind of wondering about the history over 30 years or so. My memory was when I was in that the most the Republicans ever had was 58 or 59, got down to 51 or 52. And clearly it affects what you can do, because there's usually 3 or 4, even if you've got an issue that is sponsored kind of by the Republicans. And if you've only got 51, there's usually 3 or 4 of us that have a different agenda.
Yeah, it will be tough. It's always tough to manage. I was 2010 election, so 2011 would have been my 4th or 5th session, and I remember my predecessor saying to me, as Keith could, well, they got a problem in the House, and I referring to the Republicans, and I said, what do you mean? He's like, that's too many to manage. And so, as we have seen, interestingly enough, the Senate has not had that. They've had that same kind of percentage majority here for the last 4 years, and they will 2 more. Bill Dix and Jack Whitver are 2 different kinds of leaders, and Bill really had a hold of his caucus. They marched in the same line. Whitfer is, you know, a much more hands-off type of leader, and they still have, by and large, marched in the same direction. And I don't know, you know, maybe that's just sheer numbers because there's only half as many in the Senate as the House. But now they both have these kinds of majorities. We've not seen that, and it's going to be interesting. Our job did not get easier after this election by any means.
Well, Willard, Brad called me Rain Man on election night. And interestingly enough, in recent memory, that's true. But what's pretty fascinating, if you go back to kind of the pre-1950, you would get really pretty major swings, which was surprising. Like you'll get almost 90 Democrats at some points and 90 Republicans at some points. It was, when I looked back at that, it was pretty fascinating. But, you know, Brad doesn't want to hear that on election night. He gets mad at me. He says that's too nerdy.
Okay, well, guys, thank you very much. This has been a really neat conversation this morning, and thank you all for joining us for this discussion. It's always good to have folks that have a particular insight that they're willing to bring it to us and share it with us. So thank you very much. We give you your round of applause.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah. Good to see you all.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
And we are currently planning, just looking ahead here, I got to look at my calendar quick, but December 11th would be a date that we would probably have our next Friday forum. Obviously, we're not going to be able to have our pre-session legislative reception this year. And so we are, at least at this point, planning to do another program on the 11th of December. So kind of put that on your calendar, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again then. Carrie?
Thanks, guys.
Back
Yep.
to
Thanks,
you.
everybody, for joining us, Dustin and Brad, for sure. We'll look forward to having you back either during or immediately after the session, first of the year or middle of the year, whenever it wraps up. But we really appreciate your time and your insight, Dustin. And Brad just hopped off, but thank him for us too.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Have a good weekend, all. Stay safe.